As the sun descended slowly behind the distant mountains of the Tian Shan Range, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the caravan master raised his weathered hand, signaling the end of another day's journey along the ancient Silk Road. It was the hour when the heat began to release its grip, when the air itself seemed to exhale, and when 200 camels, 40 merchants, and countless pack animals would begin the slow, methodical ritual of preparing for the night. This was the year 412 of the Common Era, and the caravan had traveled 17 days from Samarkand, moving eastward toward the jade markets of Khotan, covering perhaps 25 kilometers each day, no more. For the desert demanded patience, and patience in turn demanded rest. If you're finding this journey into the ancient world soothing, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment about which historical sleep tradition interests you most. Your support helps us create more calming historical content for restful nights. The first camel knelt, its front legs folded with a creaking sound, leather straps groaning softly as the weight shifted, and then the rear legs followed, lowering the massive creature until its belly touched the cooling sand. One by one, following the lead of the first, the other camels began their descent, a wave of movement that rippled through the caravan, like wind through wheat fields. The sound of this, 200 camels settling to earth, was like distant thunder, muffled and continuous, mixed with the soft clanking of bronze bells that hung from their necks, bells that had rung without ceasing for 11 hours of walking. The merchants dismounted slowly, their bodies stiff from the day's swaying motion atop the camels' backs. Each movement was deliberate, careful, for muscles that had been held in the same position since dawn needed time to remember their full range. Feet touched sand, and there was a moment, just a breath, when each traveler stood still, feeling the solid earth beneath them, so different from the rolling gait of the camel's stride. The sand here was fine, almost powder-like, and it held the day's warmth still, though the air above was beginning to cool, degree by degree, as evening approached. The caravan had stopped beside a caravanserai, one of the great rest houses that dotted the Silk Road every 30 to 40 kilometers, built by Persian merchants and Sogdian traders, who understood that commerce required rest, and rest required shelter. This particular caravanserai was 3 generations old, built in the time of the Sasanian Empire, when Persian influence stretched far into Central Asia. Its walls were thick, nearly 2 meters of mud brick and stone, designed to hold coolness during the day and warmth during the night. The entrance was a great arched doorway, tall enough for a loaded camel to pass through without the removal of its burden, and above this arch, carved into the stone, were words in Sogdian script. "Rest here, traveler, for the road is long, and tomorrow is another day." The interior of the caravanserai revealed itself fully, as darkness settled over the desert, and oil lamps began to glow in the covered arcade. The architecture of this place had been designed with sleep in mind, every element considered for the comfort and safety of travelers who arrived exhausted from days of desert crossing. The vaulted ceiling rose perhaps 8 meters above the stone floor, high enough to allow air to circulate, to prevent the feeling of confinement, to create a sense of spaciousness, even when 200 people sought shelter within these walls. The curves of the vault had been constructed using the Persian method, each brick angled slightly, each course building upon the previous one, creating a structure that distributed weight evenly and required no internal supports, leaving the floor space open and unobstructed. The bricks themselves told a story of construction that had taken place 73 years earlier, in the reign of Bahram V, called Bahram Gur, the wild ass hunter, the Sasanian Shah, who had encouraged trade and built infrastructure throughout his empire. Each brick bore the mark of the maker pressed into its surface while the clay was still wet. A simple symbol, a curved line intersecting two straight ones, repeated thousands of times throughout the structure. The bricks were large, larger than those used in common buildings, each one measuring perhaps 40 centimeters in length and 20 in width, and they had been fired in kilns until they achieved a deep orange-red color that darkened to brown where mortar covered their surfaces. The mortar between the bricks was a mixture of lime and sand and something else, some ingredient known to the Persian builders that gave their mortar a strength that lasted generations. In places where moisture had never reached, the mortar remained as solid as the day it was applied, while in corners where water occasionally pooled, the mortar had softened slightly, creating textures that fingers could feel, variations in hardness that told of seasons and weather and time's slow work. The walls were thick enough that a person could lie down in the depth of a window opening, thick enough to muffle the sounds of the desert wind, thick enough to hold coolness during the scorching days of summer and warmth during the freezing nights of winter. Along the inner face of the arcade, decorative elements had been incorporated into the brickwork. Geometric patterns created by setting certain bricks at angles, by leaving small gaps that created shadows, by using bricks glazed in dark blue to form stars and polygons against the orange background. These decorations served no structural purpose. They existed solely for beauty, for the pleasure of the eye, for the reminder that human beings created more than mere shelter, that even a building designed for strangers passing through deserved ornamentation and care. The floor of the arcade was paved with stone flags, each one cut roughly square, fitted together with joints so tight that a knife blade could barely slip between them. The stone was local, quarried from hills visible to the north, a pale gray stone with subtle variations in color. Here a stone with veins of darker gray running through it. There a stone with tiny fossils embedded in its surface, ancient shells from when this desert had been the floor of a primordial sea. The centuries of foot traffic had polished these stones, wearing them smooth in the paths most traveled, while stones in less frequented corners retained more of their original rough texture. The smoothness was not uniform. Rather, it created a map of human movement, showing where people walked most often, where they stood, where they knelt. Ardashir's sleeping spot was along the eastern wall, the wall that would receive the morning sun last, the wall that remained in shadow longest. He had chosen this location with the practiced knowledge of a man who had slept in dozens of caravanserais, who understood that morning heat came quickly in the desert, and that extra minutes of shade meant extra minutes of sleep. To his left, separated by perhaps 2 meters of stone floor, another merchant had arranged his sleeping area, a man from Bukhara who traded in copper vessels, whose sleeping roll was of lesser quality than Ardashir's, made of coarser wool and thinner felt, but serviceable nonetheless. To his right, the space remained empty still, though someone would claim it before the night grew much older, for the caravanserai was filling steadily as merchants completed their evening preparations and sought places to rest. The oil lamps that provided light were simple terracotta vessels, bowl-shaped, with a channel formed in the rim where a wick rested, the wick extending into the oil that filled the bowl. The oil was olive oil, traded up from Syria or Palestine, carried in amphorae along the same routes that brought silk and spices. Valuable enough that it was measured carefully, but common enough that every caravanserai maintained a supply. The wicks were strips of flax fiber, twisted and cut to the proper length, and they burned with a steady yellow flame that gave sufficient light for basic tasks, but created more shadow than illumination, transforming the arcade into a space of golden pools separated by darkness. Each lamp sat in a niche carved into the wall at intervals of perhaps 5 meters. The niches cut into the brick at shoulder height, deep enough to shelter the flame from drafts, shaped with a gentle curve that reflected light outward into the arcade. The flames moved constantly, responding to air currents too subtle to be felt, creating a gentle animation of light and shadow, a dancing flicker that was peaceful to watch, that asked nothing of the watcher, that simply continued moment after moment as oil fed wick and wick fed flame. The social hierarchy of the caravanserai revealed itself in the distribution of sleeping spaces and the quality of sleeping materials. The wealthiest merchants occupied the corners, where 2 walls met and provided additional security, where belongings could be placed against walls on 2 sides, where the sense of shelter was greatest. These merchants traveled with not only felt sleeping rolls, but also additional textiles, silk blankets, cotton pillows stuffed with down, woolen coverlets dyed in expensive colors achieved through multiple dyeing processes. Their sleeping areas occupied more space, extending perhaps 3 meters along the wall, and their servants or hired guards slept nearby, creating zones of protection and service. The middle tier of merchants, men like Ardashir, who owned their own goods and traveled independently, occupied the spaces along the walls between corners, claiming areas adequate for their needs, but without unnecessary luxury. Their sleeping materials were functional: good felt, cotton sheets, perhaps 1 additional blanket, a single pillow. They arranged their belongings within arm's reach, keeping their valuable goods close, sleeping with one hand resting on their money pouches, trusting to the general security of the caravanserai, but taking personal responsibility for their own protection. The poorest travelers, the hired caravan workers, the camel drivers, the men who owned nothing but their labor, slept in the center of the arcade or in the courtyard itself, using whatever materials they possessed or could borrow. Some had thin mats of woven reed, light enough to carry easily, but providing minimal cushioning against the stone floor. Others had only blankets, folding them double to create both cushioning and cover. Some had nothing, sleeping directly on the stone, using their bundled clothing as pillows, enduring discomfort as simply another aspect of their existence, neither complaining nor expecting better. Yet despite these differences in material comfort, all the travelers shared certain fundamental experiences. All heard the same sounds, the soft conversations that continued into the evening, the occasional laugh, the prayers spoken in Arabic or Sogdian or Persian or Chinese, the sounds of cooking, of water being poured, of someone coughing, of camels settling in the courtyard, of the night birds that called from the desert beyond the walls. All breathed the same air scented with wood smoke and cooking food and camel hair and human bodies, and the particular smell of ancient stone of brick and mortar that had absorbed years of these same scents. All watched the same stars become visible through the opening of the courtyard, the same constellations that had guided travelers for millennia, that connected this moment to countless other moments, that made the present continuous with the past. The copper merchant to Ardashir's left was preparing his evening meal, and the smell of his cooking began to drift through the arcade. He had set up a small brazier similar to Ardashir's, and on this brazier he had placed a flat iron pan, and in this pan he was heating flatbread, the round discs of wheat bread that were the foundation of every meal. Bread that had been baked that morning at the previous caravanserai and carried wrapped in cloth throughout the day. The bread was warming, becoming pliable again after having stiffened during the day. And the smell of heated wheat was comforting, familiar, the smell of sustenance and survival, the smell that said food was near and hunger would be satisfied. The copper merchant, his name was Rustam, though he had not yet spoken it to Ardashir, was also heating something in a small pot, some kind of stew or soup that contained lentils and dried vegetables and perhaps a small amount of preserved meat. Steam rose from this pot, carrying the scent of cumin and coriander, and the earthy smell of lentils that had been soaking since morning. He stirred the pot occasionally with a wooden spoon worn smooth from use, checking the consistency, judging when the food would be ready, operating with the automatic competence of someone who had cooked this same meal hundreds of times under similar circumstances. Ardashir's own pot of water had reached a full boil, the surface roiling with bubbles that rose from the bottom and burst at the top, releasing steam that rose in a column above the pot. He removed the pot from the heat, using a piece of leather to protect his hand from the hot copper, setting it on the stone floor beside his sleeping area. And then he reached into his bag and withdrew a small cloth pouch that contained his evening tea. This was not the precious tea from China, the carefully processed leaves that cost their weight in silver, but rather a more modest tea made from local herbs, dried mint leaves gathered in the mountains of Persia, dried rose hips collected in autumn and stored for winter use, a small amount of chamomile flowers purchased from a herb seller in Samarkand. He measured a small handful of this mixture into his brass cup, the dried leaves and petals crackling slightly as they settled in the bottom, and then he poured the hot water over them, filling the cup until it was nearly full. The water, striking the dried herbs, released their scents immediately. The sharp freshness of mint, the subtle sweetness of rose, the apple-like fragrance of chamomile, and steam rose from the cup carrying these fragrances, creating a small cloud of scent that hung in the still air before dispersing slowly. The herbs themselves began to rehydrate, swelling as they absorbed water, releasing their colors into the liquid, turning the clear water first pale yellow, then deeper gold, then a color like amber or honey, translucent and rich. He did not drink immediately. The tea was too hot, and besides, watching it steep was part of the ritual, part of the process of transitioning from the day's activity to the night's rest. He sat cross-legged on his felt, holding the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth radiating into his palms, watching the steam rise in slow curls, listening to the sounds of the caravanserai around him, allowing his body to settle, allowing his mind to release the concerns of commerce and travel, and the 1,000 small decisions that filled each day. The space to his right remained unclaimed, and this created a small pocket of quietness, an absence of human presence that was somehow restful. Most travelers preferred to have their sleeping areas occupied on both sides, finding security in proximity to others. But Ardashir had come to appreciate these occasional empty spaces, these small territories of solitude within the communal environment of the caravanserai. Perhaps someone would arrive late and claim the space. Perhaps it would remain empty through the night. Either outcome was acceptable. The light from the oil lamps was diminishing slightly. As the oil levels dropped, as wicks burned down and needed adjustment, as the evening progressed toward true night. The shadows were growing deeper, the areas between lamps becoming darker, and the golden pools of light were contracting, becoming smaller and more concentrated. Some merchants were already lying down, arranging themselves for sleep, even though full darkness had not yet arrived, yielding to exhaustion accumulated over days of travel. Others remained sitting, eating their evening meals, conducting quiet conversations with traveling companions, attending to small tasks of maintenance, mending a torn strap, checking the contents of their packs, counting money, writing notes in personal ledgers. One man, a merchant, from far to the east, whose features suggested origins in the lands beyond the Pamir Mountains, was sitting in a posture of meditation, his back straight, his legs folded beneath him in a complex arrangement that seemed uncomfortable, but which he maintained with perfect stillness. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and regular, his hands resting in his lap in a specific position, one palm nested within the other, thumbs touching lightly. He remained in this position without moving minute after minute, and the stillness of his body seemed to create a field of calm around him, a zone where the usual restlessness of the human animal was temporarily suspended. Whether he was praying or meditating or simply resting in a disciplined manner was impossible to know, but the quality of his stillness affected those near him, creating a sense that sleep was near, that the time for activity was ending, that the night was claiming its proper space in the rhythm of human existence. Ardashir lifted his cup of tea to his lips and sipped carefully, testing the temperature, finding it still quite hot, but drinkable. The liquid touched his tongue and released its flavors, the cooling sensation of mint, the gentle sweetness of rose, the soothing quality of chamomile, and he swallowed, feeling the warmth travel down his throat, feeling it spread through his chest, feeling his body respond to this warmth with a subtle relaxation, a softening of muscles that had been held tight throughout the day. He sipped again and again, not drinking quickly, but allowing each sip to be its own complete experience, allowing the tea to work its gentle effect on his body and mind. The tea was a form of medicine as much as a beverage. The peoples of the Silk Road understood herbs and their properties with a sophistication that came from centuries of observation and experimentation. Mint cooled internal heat and aided digestion. Rose soothed the spirit and balanced the humors. Chamomile encouraged sleep and calmed anxiety. Combined, these herbs created a preparation specifically designed for the transition from waking to sleeping, a liquid bridge between the day's activity and the night's rest. The hot water itself was beneficial, warming the body from within, satisfying thirst in a way that cold water alone could not, carrying the medicine of the herbs throughout the system. As he drank, Ardashir's thoughts began to drift in the way that thoughts drift, when the demands of consciousness begin to relax, when the need for focused attention begins to fade. He thought about tomorrow's journey, about the distance to be covered, about the landmarks they would pass, but these thoughts lacked urgency, lacked the sharpness of daytime planning. He thought about his family in Ctesiphon, about his wife and 3 children whom he had not seen for 5 months, whom he would not see for 3 months more. But these thoughts carried affection without pain, memory without longing. He thought about the goods he carried, about the prices he hoped to receive, about the complex calculations of profit and loss. But these thoughts moved slowly, lazily, like fish swimming in dark water, visible for a moment and then gone. The last light was fading from the sky, visible through the courtyard opening. What had been dark blue was becoming black, and the stars were brilliant now, no longer competing with sunlight, dominating the night sky with their thousands upon thousands of points of light. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness, like a river of light, like spilled milk, like the road that souls traveled to reach the afterlife, depending on which culture's stories one believed. The constellations were visible, the Great Bear turning slowly around the North Star, Orion rising in the east with his belt and sword, the Pleiades clustered like a handful of diamonds scattered on black velvet. Inside the walls, a courtyard opened wide and vast, perhaps 50 meters across, surrounded on all sides by a covered arcade where travelers could sleep, protected from the elements. The floor of this arcade was paved with smooth stones, worn by countless feet over countless years, each stone fitted carefully against its neighbor, creating a surface that was level and cool to the touch. Along the inner wall, iron rings had been driven into the stone at regular intervals, places where camels could be tethered, where horses could be secured, where the animals of commerce could rest as safely as the merchants themselves. The process of unpacking began with the camels. Each animal carried between 150 and 200 kilograms of goods, bolts of silk wrapped in oiled leather, bars of jade bound with hemp rope, packets of spices sealed with wax, amphorae of wine cushioned with wool, ingots of copper, bundles of rhubarb root valued as medicine, rolls of paper from the mills of Samarkand. The camel drivers moved among their charges with practiced efficiency, but efficiency in this context did not mean haste. Each strap had to be loosened slowly, each buckle examined for wear, each knot untied with care, so that the rope could be used again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. One merchant, a Persian trader named Ardashir, though his name matters less than his actions in this moment, approached his own sleeping camel and began to remove the large leather bags that had hung from either side of the animal's hump. The first bag contained his personal belongings, 3 changes of clothing, a brass cup for drinking, a small copper pot for brewing tea, a leather pouch of coins, a scroll containing letters of credit from money-lenders in Ctesiphon, and his sleeping materials. He lifted this bag. It weighed perhaps 15 kilograms, and felt the familiar strain in his shoulders, the same strain he had felt every evening for 23 years of traveling these routes. The leather of the bag was old, darkened by use and weather, soft in some places, cracked in others, and it smelled of camel hair and dust, and the faint sweetness of the cloves that had once been transported within it years ago, leaving their fragrance permanently in the leather fibers. He carried this bag to the arcade, selecting a spot along the eastern wall where the morning sun would not strike too early, where a slight depression in the stone floor suggested that many others had chosen this same location over the years. Setting down the bag, he stood for a moment, looking out across the courtyard as other merchants conducted their own versions of this same ritual, each movement a mirror of movements performed countless times before. The sky above was beginning to show the first hints of evening color, not yet the dramatic oranges and purples of sunset, but rather a softening of the day's harsh blue into something gentler, something that whispered of the night to come. From his bag, Ardashir withdrew his sleeping roll. This was his most precious possession after his commercial goods, for a merchant's success depended as much on sleep as on shrewdness. The roll was made of felt, koshma felt, produced by the nomadic peoples of the steppe, created through a process that required days of labor. The wool had been gathered from sheep in spring, when the undercoat was thickest and finest. This wool had been washed in streams, laid out on reed mats, sprinkled with hot water, and then rolled and beaten and rolled again, until the individual fibers locked together into a dense, insulating fabric. The result was a material nearly 3 centimeters thick, warm without being heavy, resistant to moisture, and so durable that a single felt could last a lifetime if cared for properly. The sleeping roll was bound with 2 leather straps, each strap passing around the circumference of the rolled felt and fastening with a simple bronze buckle. Ardashir's hands moved to the first buckle, his fingers working automatically, for he had fastened and unfastened these same buckles, perhaps 10,000 times. The bronze was warm from the day, smooth from handling, and the tongue of the buckle slipped free with a soft click that was satisfying in its simplicity. First strap loosened. Then his hands moved to the second buckle, repeating the motion, feeling the resistance of the leather as it pulled through the bronze loop, and then the release, the soft click, the freedom. Second strap loosened. He pulled the straps free entirely, coiling each one carefully and setting them aside, for leather straps left in disorder had a way of developing tangles that frustrated tired fingers in the morning darkness. Then, with both hands, he grasped the edge of the felt and began to unroll it. The outer surface appeared first. Coarse wool dyed a deep madder red, the color of dried blood or old wine, a color achieved through multiple soakings, in a bath of crushed madder root, mixed with alum to fix the dye. This outer layer bore the marks of travel, lighter patches where the sun had faded the dye, dark stains where water had once soaked through, a small burn mark near one edge where a spark from a campfire had landed. As he continued to unroll the felt, the middle layers revealed themselves, wool of a lighter color, more brown than red, less exposed to the elements, more protected. And finally, the innermost surface emerged, the side that would lie against his body during sleep. This surface was finer, made from the softest wool, and it had been worn by use into a texture like silk, smooth and gentle, a texture that seemed to welcome the body, to invite rest. Ardashir spread the felt across his chosen sleeping spot, taking care to align it properly with the space available, leaving room on either side for the merchants who would sleep adjacent to him. The felt settled onto the stone with barely a sound, just the softest whisper of wool against rock. He smoothed the edges, running his palms across the surface, feeling the familiar texture, checking for any irregularities. A small stone, perhaps, or a rough patch in the floor beneath. His hands moved slowly, pressing gently, smoothing each corner with meditative attention. The coolness of the stone floor rose through the felt, perceptible even through those 3 centimeters of dense wool, a coolness that was pleasant now in the evening warmth, but would become a source of comfort later, when the night grew cold and the felt's insulating properties would hold his body's heat close. From the bag, he withdrew a second textile, a cotton sheet, woven in the workshops of Bukhara, traded to him 3 years earlier in exchange for a small quantity of Chinese silk. This sheet was undyed, natural cotton in its pale cream color, and it was lighter than air, woven so finely that a person could see light through it, yet strong enough to endure years of washing. He spread this over the felt, creating a sleeping surface that combined the insulation of wool with the smoothness of cotton against skin. The sheet settled like morning mist, draping over the felt with natural grace, and he smoothed this too, running his hands from center to edges, pressing out invisible wrinkles, creating order from disorder. Around him, in the courtyard and arcade, 40 other merchants were performing their own versions of this same evening ritual. The sound of their movements created a quiet symphony. The soft thuds of bags being set down, the rustle of felt being unrolled, the murmur of conversations in 5 different languages, the clink of cooking pots being unpacked, the splash of water being poured from leather bottles. 2 camel drivers were leading their animals toward the well in the center of the courtyard, and the sound of the camels' feet on stone provided a steady rhythm, patient and slow, while the bronze bells on their necks continued their gentle ringing, softer now without the motion of travel. The light was changing minute by minute. What had been bright daylight was becoming something softer, something golden, as the sun moved closer to the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard, shadows of men and camels and the arcade's columns, all elongating as if reaching toward the eastern wall. The temperature was dropping slowly, perhaps half a degree every 10 minutes, and the air was beginning to carry the first hints of evening coolness, a coolness that touched the skin gently, like a soft cloth after the day's heat. Ardashir knelt beside his sleeping area and reached into his bag once more, this time withdrawing a small pillow stuffed with raw silk waste, the short fibers left over from silk production, too irregular for weaving but perfect for filling cushions. The pillow was covered in indigo-dyed cotton, the deep blue achieved through repeated dippings in vats of fermented indigo leaves, a process that took weeks and resulted in a color that seemed to hold depth within it, like looking into deep water. He placed this pillow at the head of his sleeping area, adjusting its position slightly, then adjusting it again, seeking the exact placement that his body had come to expect over years of similar evenings. The well, at the courtyard's center, was becoming a gathering point as the evening progressed. The well was old, perhaps older than the caravanserai itself, dug deep into the earth to reach water that flowed in underground channels beneath the desert. The opening was lined with stones worn smooth by ropes that had rubbed against them for generations, creating grooves where the rope always fell, channels polished by friction into curves that caught the fading light. A wooden beam stretched across the top of the well, and from this beam hung a rope thick as a man's wrist. And at the end of this rope, a leather bucket, reinforced with bronze bands. One of the camel drivers, a young man from Khwarezm with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from rope work, was drawing water. He pulled the rope hand over hand, the wet section coming up dark and dripping, while the dry section descended into darkness below. The rhythm of his pulling was steady, measured, the same rhythm that men had used at this well for 100 years, the rhythm that made the work sustainable, that allowed muscles to work without strain. The rope passed through his hands with a soft hissing sound, fiber sliding against palm, and drops of water fell from the ascending rope, splashing back into the well below with soft, plinking sounds that echoed in the stone-lined shaft. The bucket emerged from the darkness, rising into the golden evening light, and water sloshed within it, clear and cold, drawn from depths where the sun's heat never penetrated. The young man swung the bucket to one side, letting it come to rest on the stone edge of the well, and the water within it settled from turbulent motion into stillness, becoming a mirror that reflected the sky above, holding within its surface the first hints of evening stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. He lifted a clay cup from a collection of vessels that sat beside the well, cups left there for common use, belonging to no one and everyone, their surfaces smooth from countless lips. The cup was simple, unglazed, the color of the earth from which it had been formed, and it showed the marks of the potter's fingers still visible in slight ridges around its circumference. He dipped this cup into the bucket, and water flowed over its rim, filling it to overflowing, and he lifted it to his lips and drank. The water was cold, shockingly cold after the heat of the day, and it carried a faint taste of minerals from the earth through which it had filtered, a taste of stone and depth and darkness. Other merchants were approaching the well now, each waiting their turn, each respecting the unspoken protocol of the watering place. Conversations continued in low voices, discussions of prices in distant markets, news of roads ahead, reports of bandits or their absence, questions about the health of camels, observations about the weather. These conversations flowed like the water itself, continuous and unremarkable, the ordinary discourse of men whose lives were spent in motion, who measured time in caravans and seasons rather than days and hours. Ardashir rose from his sleeping area and joined the gathering at the well, carrying his brass cup, the one that traveled with him always, the one his father had given him when he first joined a caravan at the age of 14. The brass had darkened with age, developing a patina that was almost black in places, bronze-green in others, but the metal beneath remained sound, and the cup's weight in his hand was familiar and comforting. He waited his turn, watching the young camel driver refill the bucket again, watching the rope descend and rise, marking time in its simple repetition. When his turn came, he dipped his cup into the bucket, feeling the cold water rush against his fingers, numbing them slightly. He filled the cup only halfway, for that was sufficient, and excess was a form of disrespect to those who waited behind him. He drank slowly, letting the water rest in his mouth before swallowing, tasting it, feeling its coldness travel down his throat and into his chest, spreading a sensation of relief through his body. The water tasted of stone and earth and something else, something that might have been the taste of depth itself, of darkness and pressure in time. He refilled his cup once more, but this time he did not drink. Instead, he carried the water back to his sleeping area, moving carefully to avoid spilling. For water was precious, even when a well was near. He set the cup beside his pillow, placing it where he could reach it during the night should thirst wake him, and the water within the cup reflected the darkening sky, holding within its small circle an image of the world above inverted and contained. The sun was touching the horizon now, the moment when day begins its transformation into night, when light becomes something different, something richer and more complex. The sky had bloomed into color, layers of orange and pink and purple stacked like the strata in desert cliffs, each band distinct yet blending into the next. The mountains to the west were silhouetted against this display, appearing as shapes without detail, dark cutouts against radiance. The temperature was dropping more noticeably now, and merchants who had been moving in shirt sleeves were reaching for outer garments, pulling on robes of wool or cotton, wrapping themselves against the coming cold of the desert night. In the covered arcade, small cooking fires were being lit. Merchants who traveled in groups pooled their resources, sharing the work of meal preparation, while solitary travelers like Ardashir made their own simple arrangements. He withdrew from his bag a small bronze brazier, no larger than both hands cupped together, with 3 legs that lifted it above whatever surface it rested upon. This brazier was designed for burning charcoal, and he had purchased a small bag of charcoal 2 days earlier at the last caravanserai, paying 3 copper coins for fuel that would last him perhaps a week of evening cooking. He arranged a small amount of this charcoal in the brazier, building it into a tiny pyramid, each piece placed with consideration for how air would flow through the structure, how flame would climb from one piece to the next. The charcoal pieces were irregular, black and light, made from desert shrubs that burned hot and long when properly prepared. Using a fire steel and a piece of flint, tools that every traveler carried, he struck sparks into a small bundle of tinder he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. The tinder was made from the inner bark of certain trees, shredded fine and dried until it would catch from the smallest spark. 1 spark, 2, 3, and then the tinder began to glow, a tiny point of red that grew as he blew on it gently, his breath feeding the ember, encouraging it, coaxing it into flame. When the tinder burst into actual fire, he tucked it beneath the charcoal pyramid, and the flames licked upward, finding the surfaces of the charcoal, beginning the slow process of ignition. Charcoal did not catch quickly. It required patience, required persistent heat, required the flames to work their way into the porous structure of the burned wood. He waited, watching, occasionally blowing softly to encourage the process, and gradually the charcoal began to glow red at its edges, the glow spreading inward, consuming the black exterior and revealing the bright core beneath. When the charcoal was properly lit, glowing evenly without flame, he set his small copper pot atop the brazier. The pot was blackened from years of use, its once bright copper surface obscured by soot, but it remained sound, and it held perhaps half a liter of water when filled. He poured water from his leather bottle into this pot, filling it nearly to the rim, and the water hissed slightly as drops spilled over the edge and struck the hot brazier below, transforming instantly into steam that rose and vanished. The water would take time to heat, and time was something the evening offered in abundance. There was no urgency now, no destination to reach, no pace to maintain. The night stretched ahead, empty and available, a space for rest and restoration. He settled onto his sleeping area, sitting cross-legged on the felt, watching the pot as it sat above the glowing charcoal, watching other merchants conduct their own evening routines, watching the light continue to fade from the sky as stars emerged one by one, small points of light appearing in the darkening blue, growing brighter as the blue deepened toward black. The merchant from Bukhara, Rustam, had finished his evening meal and was now preparing something that immediately captured Ardashir's attention through scent alone. From a small wooden box ornately carved with geometric patterns, Rustam withdrew a collection of small cloth pouches, each one tied with string, each one containing herbs or roots or flowers gathered from different corners of the known world. The box itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, made from walnut wood darkened with age, its surface smooth from handling, its carving still sharp despite years of use. The lid fit perfectly into the body, creating a seal that protected the contents from moisture and the degrading effects of desert air. Rustam untied the first pouch with careful fingers, loosening the knot that held it closed, and the smell that emerged was immediate and distinctive. Valerian root, unmistakable in its earthy, slightly unpleasant aroma, an odor that suggested dampness and forest floors and ancient growth. The root pieces were brown and gnarled, broken into segments no longer than a finger joint, dried until they were light as paper, but still retaining their potent properties. Valerian had been used for sleep since before recorded history, known to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Persians, to peoples whose names had been lost to time but whose knowledge persisted, passed from generation to generation, through the simple fact that it worked, that it gentled the mind and invited rest. He placed 3 small pieces of valerian root on a flat stone beside his brazier, then reached for a second pouch. This one contained chamomile flowers, whole and dried, their white petals curled inward around yellow centers, still recognizable as flowers despite the drying process. The scent was sweet and slightly apple-like, a gentle counterpoint to the heavier smell of valerian. He added a small handful of these flowers to the stone, creating a mixture, balancing the strong medicine of valerian with the softer influence of chamomile, understanding through experience the proper proportions, the combinations that encouraged sleep without causing grogginess in the morning. A third pouch yielded lavender flowers, their purple color faded to gray, but their fragrance intact, that distinctive scent that was simultaneously floral and herbal, sweet and sharp, a smell that seemed to quiet the nervous system simply by being inhaled. He added just a few of these. Lavender was powerful and could overwhelm other herbs if used too generously. The fourth pouch contained dried lemon balm leaves, their citrus scent bright and uplifting even in dried form, and he crumbled several leaves between his fingers, releasing their oils, adding them to the growing mixture on the stone. Using a small copper mortar and pestle, Rustam began to grind these ingredients together, working with a circular motion that was steady and patient, not rushing the process. The pestle moved around the mortar's interior in slow circles, crushing the dried plant materials, breaking down their structure, releasing oils and essences that had been locked within cellular walls. The sound of this grinding was rhythmic and soothing, a soft, crushing sound, a gentle scraping as copper moved against copper, a whisper of dried herbs being reduced to smaller pieces. As he worked, the various scents blended and intensified, creating a complex fragrance that filled the air around his sleeping area and drifted into the spaces nearby. Ardashir watched this preparation with the interest of someone who understood that knowledge of herbs was valuable, was worth observing, was worth learning. He had his own herbs for tea, his simple mixture of mint and rose and chamomile. But Rustam's collection was clearly more extensive, more sophisticated, the result of either deeper knowledge or access to better sources or both. The grinding continued for several minutes, the pestle moving steadily, the mixture in the mortar becoming finer, transforming from recognizable pieces of roots and flowers into a coarse powder that combined all the colors and textures of its constituent parts. When Rustam judged the mixture sufficiently ground, he transferred it to a small brass pot similar to Ardashir's, adding water from his leather bottle. The pot went on to his brazier, settling into position above the glowing charcoal, and almost immediately the water began to warm. And as it warmed, the herbs within it began to release their properties into the liquid, turning clear water into medicine, into sleep aid, into a preparation that had been refined over centuries of use by travelers who needed rest, who needed to recover from exhaustion, who needed to face another day of difficult travel with bodies and minds restored. While waiting for his preparation to heat, Rustam turned to Ardashir and spoke for the first time that evening. His voice was soft, pitched low so as not to disturb others who were already sleeping, and his Persian had the accent of Transoxiana, the regions beyond the Oxus River, where Persian mixed with Sogdian and other languages to create distinctive speech patterns. "The tea you drink," he said, "is it sufficient for sleep after a long day's travel? Or do you sometimes find yourself lying awake, watching the stars turn, counting the hours until dawn?" Ardashir considered this question, recognizing it as an opening to conversation, but also as a genuine inquiry, not merely politeness. "Some nights," he replied, keeping his own voice equally quiet, "the tea is enough, and sleep comes easily. Other nights, especially after days when there have been difficulties, a lame camel, a merchant who tries to renegotiate prices, news of bandits on the road ahead, the mind refuses to settle, and sleep remains distant even when the body is exhausted." Rustam nodded, a gesture that suggested both understanding and expectation of this answer. "I traveled for 15 years, he said, using only mint tea in the evenings, and I thought this was sufficient, that this was what travelers did, that difficulty sleeping was simply part of the life we had chosen. Then I met a physician in Merv, a man who had studied in Jundishapur, who understood herbs as deeply as most men understand the roads they travel daily. He taught me about combinations, about how certain herbs work together to create effects that no single herb can achieve alone." He gestured toward his brass pot, where steam was beginning to rise from the surface of the water, carrying with it the complex scent of his herbal mixture. "Valerian," he continued, "is powerful for sleep, but used alone it can cause a heaviness in the morning, a difficulty in waking fully. Chamomile softens this effect, while adding its own calming properties. Lavender quiets the thoughts that circle endlessly when we are overtired. Lemon balm lifts the spirit just enough to prevent the sadness that sometimes accompanies deep exhaustion. Together, these herbs create a preparation that brings sleep naturally, that allows the body to rest completely, and that permits awakening without difficulty when dawn arrives." Ardashir listened with the attention of a merchant evaluating goods, assessing both the information and the person providing it. "And you carry these herbs with you?" he asked. "You have sufficient quantity for an entire journey?" "I carry enough for my own use," Rustam replied, "and I replenish my supply at certain cities along the route where herb markets are reliable. In Merv, there is a market near the southern gate where 3 herb sellers maintain shops, and their goods are both authentic and reasonably priced. In Bukhara, my own city, there are herb gardens maintained by physicians, and a person with proper introductions can purchase directly from these gardens. In Samarkand, the market near the Mosque of the Congregational Prayers has several stalls where herbs from both the mountains and the steppes can be found." His pot was steaming vigorously now, and he removed it from the heat with a practiced motion, setting it on the stone floor to cool slightly. The liquid within had turned a dark amber color, almost brown, and its surface was covered with tiny fragments of herbs that had escaped the initial grinding, floating like islands on a miniature sea. He let it sit for a time, allowing the temperature to drop from boiling to merely very hot, allowing the herbs to continue steeping, allowing their properties to transfer more completely into the water. "The physician in Merv," Rustam continued, returning to his narrative, "taught me also about the timing of these preparations. He said that the herbs work best when consumed approximately 1 hour before one intends to sleep, that this allows time for the stomach to process them, for the body to absorb their properties, for their effects to build gradually rather than arriving suddenly. He said that sleep forced by medicine is not the same as sleep invited by medicine, and that the difference lies in the timing and the gentleness of the approach." Ardashir found himself drawn into this discussion, finding in it a quality of practical wisdom that appealed to his merchant sensibility. "And have you found this timing to be accurate?" he asked. "Does the sleep that comes after drinking such a preparation differ from ordinary sleep?" "The sleep itself," Rustam said, pouring his herbal preparation through a small strainer into a ceramic cup, catching the larger particles while allowing the liquid to pass through, "is deeper and more continuous. Ordinarily, I wake several times during the night, perhaps from cold, perhaps from a sound, perhaps from dreams, or for no reason at all. After drinking this preparation, I sleep from the time my head touches the pillow until the time before dawn, when my body naturally wakes, and the sleep is smooth, unbroken, restorative in a way that ordinary sleep sometimes fails to be." He lifted the cup to his lips and sipped carefully, testing the temperature, then sipped again, more substantially. His expression suggested satisfaction with what he had created. After a moment, he looked at Ardashir and said, "I have sufficient herbs to share, if you would like to try this preparation tonight. The offer is made without expectation of payment or trade, simply as one traveler to another, sharing knowledge that might prove useful." This offer created a small moment of decision for Ardashir, a choice between maintaining the independence he had preserved throughout the evening and accepting an interaction that would create a social obligation. Minor though it might be, the culture of the Silk Road operated on such exchanges: small gifts, small kindnesses, the creation of networks of reciprocal obligation that made travel safer and more pleasant. To refuse would be to reject not just the herbs, but the social gesture, while to accept would be to enter into a relationship, however temporary, with this man from Bukhara. "I would be grateful to try your preparation," Ardashir said, making his choice, accepting the implicit terms. "If the results are as you describe, I would also be grateful to learn which herbs you use and in what proportions, so that I might prepare such a mixture for myself in the future." Rustam smiled, a brief expression that created creases around his eyes, and reached for his wooden box of herbs. He began the process again, untying pouches, measuring out small quantities of valerian root, chamomile flowers, lavender, lemon balm, grinding them together in his mortar, the pestle moving in those same steady circles. As he worked, he spoke about proportions, about the relationships between the herbs. "Valerian is the foundation," he said, "perhaps half of the total mixture by volume. Chamomile makes up perhaps a quarter. Lavender and lemon balm together make up the final quarter, with slightly more lemon balm than lavender, for balance." He added these ground herbs to Ardashir's brass cup, then poured hot water from Ardashir's pot over them, filling the cup nearly to the rim. The water, which had cooled somewhat since boiling, was still hot enough to extract the herb's properties, and immediately the familiar smells began to emerge: the earthy valerian, the sweet chamomile, the aromatic lavender, the citrus lemon balm, blending together into a scent that was complex and inviting, a fragrance that seemed to carry within it the promise of rest. "Let it steep," Rustam instructed, "for the time it takes to breathe slowly 20 times, and then drink it while it is still quite warm. The warmth itself is part of the medicine, helping to relax the body from within." Ardashir held the cup in both hands, feeling its heat, watching the steam rise, and began to count breaths, in slowly through the nose, out slowly through the mouth, each breath a deliberate act, each exhalation a small release of tension. Around them in the caravanserai, the sounds of evening were diminishing. Conversations were ending, replaced by the sounds of people settling for sleep, the rustle of blankets being adjusted, the soft sighs of bodies finding comfortable positions, the occasional cough or clearing of throat. The oil lamps were burning lower, their flames smaller, their light dimmer, creating deeper shadows, transforming the arcade into a place where darkness was primary and light was the exception. After 20 breaths, Ardashir raised the cup to his lips and drank. The liquid was still very warm, but no longer hot enough to burn, and its taste was unlike anything he had experienced in his evening teas. The valerian had an earthy, slightly bitter quality that was not unpleasant, but was certainly strong, suggesting medicine rather than pleasure. The chamomile added sweetness and smoothness, softening the valerian's edge. The lavender contributed a floral note that was subtle but distinctive, while the lemon balm provided brightness, a citrus accent that lifted the entire mixture and prevented it from becoming too heavy or too dark in character. He drank slowly, taking small sips, allowing the liquid to rest in his mouth before swallowing, and with each swallow he could feel warmth spreading through his chest, through his stomach, radiating outward into his limbs. Whether this warmth was purely physical, the heat of the liquid affecting his internal organs, or whether it represented the beginning of the herb's effects on his system, was impossible to determine. But the sensation was pleasant, was calming, was exactly what his body seemed to need after the long day of travel. The meditating merchant from the east had not moved, remained sitting in perfect stillness, his breathing so slow and regular that it was barely perceptible, his body so motionless that he might have been carved from wood rather than made of flesh. Watching him, Ardashir found his own breathing beginning to slow, beginning to deepen, becoming more deliberate and less automatic. The monastery traditions of the East taught breathing exercises as paths to mental clarity and spiritual development. But these same techniques could serve purely practical purposes, could help ordinary travelers calm their minds and prepare for sleep. Rustam had finished his own cup of herbal preparation and was now lying down on his sleeping area, pulling a woolen blanket over himself, adjusting his pillow with small movements until it supported his head at the preferred angle. His movements were slow and measured, and there was something peaceful about watching another person prepare for sleep, something that suggested that sleep was near for everyone, that the night was claiming its proper territory, that the time for consciousness was ending and the time for dreams approaching. Ardashir finished his cup, draining the last of the liquid, finding at the bottom small pieces of herbs that had escaped both grinding and straining, finding their texture soft and harmless on his tongue. He swallowed these as well, wasting nothing, and then set his cup aside, placing it where he could reach it easily in the morning when he would want water first thing upon waking. His sleeping area was prepared, the felt spread smoothly, the cotton sheet arranged properly, the silk-filled pillow positioned correctly. His bag of belongings was within arm's reach. His money pouch was secured in an inner pocket of his robe. His knife was at his side, though he did not expect to need it. He lay down, feeling the felt beneath him, feeling the cotton sheet against his skin, feeling the pillow support his head. The stone floor was hard beneath the felt, but the felt was thick enough to prevent discomfort, and the combination of stone's coolness and felt's insulation created a temperature that was neither too warm nor too cold. He pulled his woolen blanket over himself, covering his body from shoulders to feet, and arranged it carefully, ensuring that no gaps admitted drafts, ensuring that its weight was distributed evenly. Lying on his back, looking upward, he could see the vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness, could see the curves of the arches faintly illuminated by the distant oil lamps, could see the play of light and shadow on ancient brick. The sounds of the caravanserai had diminished further, now mostly just the sound of breathing, of 40 men sleeping or preparing to sleep, of camels shifting in the courtyard, of the desert wind moving past the thick walls, with a sound so faint it was felt more than heard. The herbs were working. He could feel their effects now, not dramatically but unmistakably. A softening of his thoughts, a heaviness in his limbs, a gentle pulling sensation, as if sleep were a tide and he a boat being drawn out from shore. His mind, which ordinarily would be reviewing the day's events or planning tomorrow's activities or simply wandering among memories and concerns, was instead becoming quiet, becoming still, thoughts arising and dissolving without gaining traction, without developing into chains of association that would sustain wakefulness. The merchant from the eastern lands, the one who had been sitting in meditation, finally moved. His stillness broke slowly, like ice melting in spring sunshine, beginning with the smallest adjustment of his hands, then a subtle shift of his shoulders, then the gradual unfolding of his legs from their complex arrangement. He stood with the careful movements of someone whose limbs had been held in one position for a long time, and he stretched, not dramatically, but with a series of gentle extensions that allowed blood to flow again, that reminded muscles of their full range of motion. Then he walked to the edge of the arcade where the covered space met the open courtyard, and he stood there, looking upward at the night sky. The stars had reached their full brilliance now, no longer competing with any remnant of daylight, no longer diminished by the glow of sunset or the anticipation of moonrise. The moon would rise later, much later, in the hours before dawn, and until then the stars ruled completely, their light sufficient to cast faint shadows, sufficient to reveal the general shapes of the courtyard and the buildings around it, sufficient to navigate by for those whose eyes had adapted to darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the vault of heaven like a river of light, like a pathway, like the spine of the celestial sphere, composed of stars so numerous and so distant that they merged into a continuous glow rather than remaining distinct points. The merchant stood motionless, his head tilted back, his gaze fixed on the heavens, and after several minutes of this observation, he reached into his traveling bag and withdrew an object wrapped in silk cloth. He unwrapped this carefully, folding back the layers of silk with reverent attention, and revealed an astrolabe, an instrument of brass and bronze, circular, perhaps the width of 2 hands, its surface covered with engraved markings, its components arranged in layers that could rotate relative to one another. Even in the dim light from the distant oil lamps, the instrument gleamed with the particular luster of well-maintained metal, and its engravings caught what little light was available, creating patterns of brightness against darkness. An astrolabe was a device of extraordinary sophistication, embodying centuries of astronomical observation and mathematical development. The Persians had refined its construction, building on Greek foundations, adding their own innovations, creating an instrument that could determine the positions of celestial bodies, calculate the time of day or night, find the direction of Mecca for prayer, determine latitude, and perform numerous other calculations related to navigation and timekeeping. To own such an instrument indicated either wealth or scholarly inclination or both, for astrolabes were expensive, their construction requiring the skills of specialized craftsmen who understood both metalworking and the astronomical principles the instrument represented. This particular astrolabe appeared to be of Persian manufacture, likely from one of the workshops in Isfahan or Shiraz, where the best instrument makers maintained their practices. Its front face consisted of multiple brass plates, the mater, which formed the main body, and several interchangeable plates called tympans, each one engraved with the circles and lines that represented the celestial sphere as viewed from a specific latitude. On top of these plates rotated the rete, a framework of brass that represented the positions of specific stars and the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to follow through the sky over the course of a year. The rete was pierced and shaped so that certain bright stars were indicated by pointers, allowing an observer to align the instrument with the actual sky, and thereby determine information about time and position. The merchant held the astrolabe in his left hand, supporting its weight from below, and with his right hand he rotated the rete slowly, watching how its pattern of curves and points corresponded to the stars visible above him. He was finding Polaris, the North Star, the fixed point around which all other stars appeared to rotate, the navigator's most reliable reference. Polaris was not the brightest star in the sky, but its position made it invaluable. It stood almost exactly above the Earth's northern pole, and its altitude above the horizon indicated latitude directly. A traveler who could measure the angle to Polaris could determine how far north or south he had traveled with reasonable accuracy. He adjusted the alidade, the rotating arm on the back of the astrolabe that served as a sighting tool, pointing it toward Polaris, bringing the star into alignment with the sighting holes at each end of the arm. He held the astrolabe vertically, allowing it to hang from his thumb as the instrument was designed to do, ensuring that gravity kept it properly aligned. Then he read the scale engraved around the edge of the back face, determining the angle, noting the position, performing in moments a calculation that would have required considerable time and effort if done with other methods. Ardashir watched this process with the particular interest of someone who understood that knowledge came in many forms, that navigation required different skills than commerce, that the merchant who could read the stars possessed a kind of literacy as valuable as the ability to read ledgers and calculate profits. He had used simpler methods for navigation, following established routes, traveling with caravans that included experienced guides, noting landmarks, trusting to the collective knowledge of the group. But this solitary use of an astrolabe suggested a different kind of travel, a more independent approach, the ability to find one's way without relying on others. The Eastern merchant, having completed his observation of Polaris, now rotated the astrolabe and pointed its alidade toward other stars in turn. He was finding Vega in the constellation Lyra, bright and blue-white, one of the brightest stars in the northern sky. He was finding Altair in Aquila. He was finding Deneb in Cygnus. These three stars formed a large triangle in the sky, a pattern so prominent during certain seasons that it served as a navigational aid even for those without instruments, a celestial landmark visible across vast distances and unchanging in its essential configuration despite the rotation of the heavens. As he worked with his astrolabe, other merchants in the caravanserai, who were not yet asleep, began to pay attention, drawn by the novelty of seeing such an instrument in use, curious about its function, interested in the information it might provide. Two men rose from their sleeping areas and walked quietly to where the Eastern merchant stood, positioning themselves so they could see both the astrolabe and the sky, attempting to understand the relationship between the instrument and the celestial sphere it represented. One of these men was a Syrian merchant, whose sleeping area was near the western corner of the arcade. He spoke in Arabic, asking, "Can you determine from your observations what hour of the night this is? How much time remains until dawn?" The Eastern merchant replied in Persian, his accent suggesting origins far to the east, perhaps in the lands where Chinese influence met Persian, where Buddhism mixed with other traditions, where trade routes from multiple directions converged. "The stars tell me," he said, "that approximately 4 hours have passed since sunset, and approximately 5 hours remain until sunrise. The night is somewhat past its middle point. Those who seek sleep should seek it now, for the remaining hours will pass quickly, and dawn comes whether one has slept or not." The Syrian merchant nodded, satisfied with this information, and asked another question. "And can your instrument tell you our position, how far we have traveled from our starting point, how far remains to our destination?" "The latitude, yes," the Eastern merchant replied. "I can determine with reasonable accuracy we are at approximately 40 degrees north, which corresponds to the latitude of cities such as Merv and Bukhara. The longitude, the east-west position, cannot be determined from stars alone, at least not without complex observations over multiple nights and calculations that require reference tables I do not carry with me. But the established routes of the Silk Road are well enough known that latitude information alone is often sufficient to confirm one's position along the route. He rotated the astrolabe again, showing its back face to those who were watching, pointing out the various scales and markings engraved there. This scale, he said, indicating a series of curves, allows calculation of the times of prayer for the Islamic faith, though I myself follow the Buddha's teachings and do not use it for this purpose. This scale shows the hours of daylight at different times of year. These markings indicate the astrological signs, which some believe influence human affairs, though others consider this superstition rather than knowledge. The astrolabe was more than a scientific instrument. It was also a work of art. Its engravings were beautiful as well as functional, the curves and lines executed with a precision that spoke of skilled hands and patient work. The Arabic script naming certain stars was calligraphic, decorative, pleasing to the eye even for those who could not read the language. The brass itself had been polished until it held a deep, golden luster, and though years of handling had created areas of darker patina, these only added character, creating a visual record of the instrument's history of use. After several more minutes of observation and calculation, the Eastern merchant carefully wrapped his astrolabe again in its silk cloth, folding the fabric around it with the same careful attention he had used in unwrapping it, then securing the package with a silk cord tied in a complex knot that would reveal any tampering. He returned to his sleeping area and placed the wrapped instrument inside his bag, positioning it where it would be cushioned by his spare clothing, where it would be protected from impacts, where it would remain safe through the night. But he did not immediately lie down. Instead, he sat again in the cross-legged position he had maintained earlier, his back straight, his hands resting in his lap in that specific configuration. And he closed his eyes and became still. This time, however, his stillness had a different quality. Less the intense concentration of earlier meditation, more the gentle quietness of someone allowing sleep to approach naturally. Someone creating within himself the conditions that invited rest without forcing it. The practice of meditation before sleep was common among Buddhist travelers, part of a tradition that understood the transition from waking to sleeping as a significant moment, a doorway between states of consciousness that deserved attention and respect. The theory held that the quality of one's mental state at the moment of falling asleep influenced the quality of sleep itself, the nature of dreams, and even the ease of waking. A mind that approached sleep while agitated or preoccupied would carry that agitation into sleep, resulting in restless dreams and fragmented rest. A mind that approached sleep in a state of calm clarity would sleep more deeply and wake more refreshed. The technique was simple in concept, though difficult in execution. One sat comfortably, closed the eyes, and observed the breath without attempting to control it, simply noting its natural rhythm, noting the sensation of air entering and leaving the body, noting the subtle movements of chest and abdomen. When thoughts arose, as thoughts inevitably did, one acknowledged them without engagement, allowing them to pass like clouds across the sky, returning attention always to the breath. Gradually, with practice, the mind became quieter, thoughts became less frequent and less compelling, and a quality of inner stillness developed that made the transition to sleep smooth and natural. Ardashir, lying on his sleeping area, watching this display of meditation and astronomical observation, found himself thinking about the different approaches to sleep that were represented in this single caravanserai on this single evening. Rustam had approached sleep through herbs, through the careful preparation of plant medicines that influenced the body's chemistry, that encouraged rest through physical means. The Eastern merchant approached sleep through mental discipline, through practices that calmed the mind and prepared consciousness for its nightly dissolution. Ardashir himself had used a combination of routine and modest herbal tea, relying on the familiar rhythms of evening preparation to signal his body that the time for sleep had arrived. Yet all these approaches shared common elements. They all recognized that sleep required preparation, that the transition from activity to rest was not instantaneous, that the mind and body needed time and appropriate conditions to release the day's concerns and enter the state of vulnerability that sleep required. They all understood that the quality of sleep affected the quality of life, that a merchant who slept well could trade more effectively, could endure hardship more successfully, could maintain the mental clarity needed for complex negotiations and dangerous journeys. The herbs that Rustam had given him were working more noticeably now. The sensation was not dramatic. There was no sudden overwhelming sleepiness, no loss of awareness or confusion, but rather a gentle, progressive deepening of relaxation. His muscles felt heavy, felt as though they were sinking into the felt beneath him. His thoughts were becoming slower, more diffuse, less connected to each other. When he closed his eyes, the darkness behind his eyelids seemed welcoming rather than void, seemed like a place he wanted to remain rather than a place to escape from. The sounds of the caravanserai had diminished to their nighttime minimum. The breathing of sleeping men created a soft background rhythm, not quite synchronized, but creating patterns that the listening ear could follow. Waves of inhalation and exhalation, washing through the arcade like tides. Occasionally, someone would shift position, and the sound of fabric rustling against felt would briefly rise above the general quietness, then subside again. In the courtyard, a camel made a low, rumbling sound, that peculiar noise that camels produce in their throats. Neither quite a groan, nor quite a growl, a sound that was somehow both complaint and contentment simultaneously. The oil lamps were burning very low now, their wicks nearly consumed, their oil supplies nearly exhausted. The flames had diminished to tiny points of light that barely illuminated their own immediate surroundings, leaving most of the arcade in darkness, punctuated by these small islands of dim orange glow. Soon these lamps would burn out entirely, and the caravanserai would be in complete darkness, except for whatever starlight penetrated through the courtyard opening and whatever glow remained in the dying cooking fires scattered around the arcade's perimeter. Ardashir rolled onto his side, a position he found more comfortable for actual sleep than lying on his back. The silk-filled pillow compressed slightly, conforming to the shape of his head, providing support for his neck while allowing his head to rest at a natural angle. He pulled the woolen blanket more snugly around his shoulders, tucking it in to eliminate drafts, creating a cocoon of warmth that contrasted pleasantly with the cool air on his face. His right hand rested on the felt beneath his pillow, near the small knife that lay there, not because he expected danger, but because its presence was a habit, a small insurance against unlikely possibilities. The stars visible through the courtyard opening were magnificent, undimmed by any artificial light, brilliant against the absolute blackness of the sky. The Great Bear was clearly visible, its 7 main stars forming the distinctive pattern that every traveler knew, the 2 pointer stars at the end of the bowl indicating the direction to Polaris. The bear was rotating slowly around Polaris as it did every night, making its endless circle. And watching this rotation was like watching the movement of a celestial clock, marking time in hours and seasons and years. Different cultures told different stories about these stars. The Greeks saw a bear, placed in the heavens by Zeus. The Chinese saw a bureaucratic official's carriage. The Arabs saw a funeral bier followed by mourning daughters. The Persians saw a throne. All these interpretations were attempts to make sense of patterns, to impose narrative on randomness, to connect the human world with the cosmic order. The stars themselves remained indifferent to these stories, continued their movements according to laws that operated regardless of human observation or interpretation. The Eastern merchant had finally stopped meditating and was lying down now, arranging himself for sleep with the same measured movements he brought to everything else, pulling his blanket into position, adjusting his pillow with small touches, settling into stillness. Within moments, his breathing deepened and slowed, indicating that sleep had come quickly, the result perhaps of his meditation practice, perhaps of simple exhaustion, perhaps of some combination of preparation and need. Rustam, to Ardashir's left, was already deeply asleep, his breathing regular and untroubled, his body completely still except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The herbs he had consumed earlier had clearly done their work, guiding him into sleep smoothly and maintaining that sleep without disturbance. His face, barely visible in the dim light, appeared peaceful, relaxed, free from the tensions and concerns that showed themselves during waking hours. Sleep was a kind of surrender, a willingness to release control, to trust that the body would continue its essential functions without conscious oversight, to accept vulnerability in exchange for restoration. Ardashir's own eyes were becoming heavy, difficult to keep open, and when he closed them, the effort required to open them again seemed increasingly substantial, increasingly unnecessary. The herbs and the routine and the simple accumulated exhaustion of the day were combining to pull him toward sleep, and he was offering less and less resistance, allowing the pull to strengthen, allowing consciousness to begin its nightly dissolution. His last clear thought was about tomorrow's journey, about the distance to be covered. But even this thought lacked urgency, lacked the sharp edges of daytime planning, becoming instead more like a dream of planning, an image of tomorrow that floated in his mind without demanding anything, without requiring response or decision. The transition from waking to sleeping is always mysterious, always impossible to observe directly, because the moment of transition is the moment when the observer ceases to observe. There is waking, and then there is sleeping, and between them is a gap, a discontinuity, a space where consciousness lets go of itself and something else takes over, something that operates according to different rules, that creates the strange logic of dreams, that processes the day's experiences in ways that conscious thought cannot replicate. Ardashir felt himself approaching this gap, felt the familiar sensation of slipping, of falling, of releasing, and he let it happen, let go, allowed sleep to claim him. The hours before dawn held a particular quality of stillness that existed at no other time of day or night. The deep night had passed, that period when even the restless slept, when the world seemed most completely given over to darkness and rest. Now, in the hours that the Chinese called the fifth watch, when the night had not yet released its hold, but dawn was beginning to gather its strength in the eastern sky, a different atmosphere prevailed, something that was neither fully night nor the beginning of day, but rather a transitional space where both coexisted. In the caravanserai, most of the merchants and travelers continued to sleep deeply, their breathing slow and regular, their bodies still beneath blankets and sleeping rolls, taking the full measure of rest that the night offered. But a few had begun to stir, responding to some internal clock that marked the approach of dawn, some instinct that recognized when sufficient sleep had been achieved, some discipline that called them to wakefulness while others slept. These early risers moved quietly, respectful of those still sleeping, conducting their pre-dawn activities with minimal sound, creating only the softest disturbances in the general silence. The Eastern merchant was among the first to wake. His eyes opened suddenly, completely, without the gradual transition that characterized most people's awakening. One moment he was asleep, the next fully conscious, alert, oriented to his surroundings immediately. This capacity for instant wakefulness was perhaps a result of years of meditation practice, or perhaps simply a natural characteristic of his temperament. But it allowed him to move from sleep to activity without the drowsy confusion that affected others. He lay still for a few moments, not moving his body, simply observing the quality of darkness, listening to the sounds around him, assessing the time without needing to consult instruments or ask others. He rose in sections, slowly unfolding from his sleeping position, sitting up gradually, allowing his body time to adjust to vertical orientation after hours of horizontal rest. He folded his blanket with precise movements, creating neat corners, smoothing out wrinkles, transforming the loose fabric into a compact rectangle. He rolled his sleeping felt with equal care, working methodically from one end to the other, ensuring that the roll was tight and even, that it would occupy minimal space in his traveling bag. These actions were performed with a quality of attention that suggested ritual rather than mere routine, each movement complete in itself, not rushed toward the next action, but fully present in the current one. From his bag, he withdrew a small brass bowl, undecorated, functional, slightly dented from years of travel and use. He also withdrew a leather water bottle, full from the previous evening's filling at the well. He poured water into the bowl until it was half full, then set the bowl on the stone floor beside his sleeping area. The water's surface caught what little ambient light existed, starlight filtering through the courtyard opening, the faint glow of pre-dawn that was beginning to appear in the eastern sky, and reflected it, creating a small pool of dim luminescence in the surrounding darkness. He dipped his hands into the water, cupping them, bringing water to his face. The water was cold, shockingly so in the pre-dawn chill, and it erased immediately any remaining drowsiness, bringing complete alertness. He washed his face thoroughly, the water running down his cheeks and jaw, dripping from his chin back into the bowl. He washed his hands, rubbing them together, cleaning each finger individually, attending to the spaces between fingers, the area around fingernails, the backs of hands as well as palms. This washing was both hygienic and symbolic, a purification that prepared him for the meditation and prayers that would follow, a transition between the state of sleep and the state of spiritual practice. After washing, he dried his hands and face on a small cloth of undyed cotton, then folded this cloth and returned it to his bag. He took from the bag a string of beads, a mala, used in Buddhist practice for counting prayers or mantras, consisting of 108 beads carved from sandalwood, smooth from handling, dark with the oils from thousands of touches. He draped this over his wrist, where it would be ready when needed, and then he sat in the meditation posture he had used the previous evening, back straight, legs folded, hands positioned in a specific configuration that held symbolic meaning within his tradition. He closed his eyes and became still, and his breathing slowed and deepened, falling into a rhythm that was slower than ordinary breathing, but not so slow as to require effort, a natural rhythm that the body adopted when given permission to find its own pace. In this state he would remain for perhaps half an hour, performing whatever internal practices his tradition prescribed for the pre-dawn period, working with mind and breath and awareness in ways that were invisible to external observation, but that served purposes he considered essential. Other early risers were beginning their own pre-dawn routines. A Muslim merchant from the western end of the arcade had awakened and was preparing for the first prayer of the day, the Fajr prayer that was performed in the period between the first lightening of the sky and the actual sunrise. He had risen quietly, had performed the ritual washing prescribed for prayer, washing hands, mouth, nose, face, arms, head, ears, feet, using water from his own supply, being careful not to waste any drops, conscious that water was precious, and that his supply needed to last until the caravan reached its next source. After washing, he spread a small prayer rug on the stone floor, orienting it carefully toward Mecca, toward the southwest, from this location in Central Asia, using his knowledge of geography and the position of the stars to determine the correct direction. The rug was small, just large enough for a person to stand, kneel, and prostrate upon, woven with a simple geometric pattern in dark reds and blues, worn thin in the center, where knees and forehead had touched it countless times. He stood on this rug, facing the Qibla, and raised his hands beside his head, and began the prayer in a low voice, barely audible, just the softest murmur of Arabic phrases, the words of the opening chapter of the Quran followed by other verses, the ancient formulas that 1 billion people had recited across 1,000 years. His movements were precise, flowing from standing to bowing to prostration and back to standing. Each position held for the prescribed duration, each transition smooth and practiced. Twice he prostrated completely, bringing his forehead to the rug, bending his body in the ultimate gesture of submission and humility, acknowledging through physical posture a relationship with the divine that words alone could not fully express. The prayer took perhaps 10 minutes from beginning to end, and when he finished, he remained kneeling on the rug for a few moments, hands raised in supplication, making personal prayers that supplemented the formal liturgical ones, asking for safe travel, for success in commerce, for the well-being of family members far away. Ardashir woke more gradually than these disciplined early risers, emerging from sleep slowly, drifting upward through layers of consciousness, becoming aware First, of bodily sensation. The hardness of the floor beneath the felt, the weight of the blanket over him, the position of his limbs, before opening his eyes to see the dim, pre-dawn darkness around him. The herbs Rustam had given him had worked as promised. He had slept deeply and continuously, without waking during the night, without the fragmented rest that sometimes plagued him. His body felt restored, his mind clear, ready for another day of travel despite the accumulated fatigue of many days on the road. He lay still for a time, not yet ready to abandon the comfort of his sleeping area, listening to the sounds of those who were already active, observing without participating, allowing himself these final minutes of rest before engaging with the demands of the day. The sky visible through the courtyard opening was beginning to show the first hints of coming dawn. Not yet any direct light, but a subtle change in the quality of darkness, a faint paling along the eastern horizon that suggested that somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the sun was preparing to rise. The temperature had dropped to its lowest point, that coldest moment that occurs just before dawn, when the earth has radiated away as much heat as it will lose, before the sun begins the process of warming the world again. The air was sharp, almost painful to breathe, and Ardashir could see his breath condensing into small clouds of vapor that formed and dissipated with each exhalation. Under his blanket he was warm, the wool trapping his body heat, but his face was exposed to the cold air, and the contrast was significant. He sat up slowly, swinging his legs around, placing his feet on the cold stone floor. Even through the felt that had been beneath him, the cold of the stone was perceptible, and when his bare feet touched the floor directly, the cold was intense, immediate, shocking. He reached quickly for his boots, pulling them on, lacing them with fingers that were stiff from cold, grateful for the protection they provided. He wrapped his woolen robe more tightly around himself, pulling it closed, tying the sash that held it in place, adding another layer against the morning chill. From his bag, he withdrew his brass cup and the leather bottle that held his water supply. He poured water into the cup. It came out sluggishly, colder than it had been the previous evening, approaching the temperature at which it might begin to freeze if the cold continued much longer. He drank, feeling the cold water shock his system, feeling it travel down his throat and into his stomach, bringing a different kind of wakefulness than sleep's ending had provided. The water tasted of leather from the bottle and of minerals from whatever source had filled it, but it was clean and satisfying, exactly what his body needed after hours without hydration. Around him, more merchants were beginning to wake, responding to the activity of those already up, responding to their own internal rhythms, responding to the lightening sky. The caravanserai was transitioning from a place of sleep to a place of preparation, from night to morning, from rest to activity. The sounds were changing, less breathing, more movement, voices beginning to emerge as people greeted each other, asked about sleep quality, discussed the day's planned activities. The oil lamps had all burned out during the night, their fuel exhausted, their wicks consumed, leaving only the growing natural light to illuminate the space. Rustam, the copper merchant from Bukhara, woke and immediately looked toward Ardashir, as if checking to see whether the herbs had worked as promised. When he saw Ardashir awake and apparently well rested, he smiled and spoke quietly. The preparation was successful? You slept well? Very well, Ardashir replied, keeping his voice equally quiet out of respect for those still sleeping. Better than I have slept in many nights. The herbs worked exactly as you described. Sleep came easily and continued without interruption, until my body naturally woke just now. Good, Rustam said, satisfied. When you next reach a city with proper herb markets, I recommend you obtain these herbs for yourself. The proportions I described yesterday will serve you well, though you may wish to adjust them slightly based on your own response. Some people need more valerian, others less. Some prefer more lavender, others find it too strong. The art of herbal preparation involves both following established knowledge and adapting it to individual circumstances. The Eastern merchant had completed his meditation and was now preparing tea in a manner quite different from the simple brewing that Ardashir and others practiced. He had lit a small charcoal fire in a brass brazier, and above this he had placed a special pot designed for tea preparation. Not the simple copper pots that most travelers carried, but a vessel made of iron, blackened with age, its interior coated with deposits from years of use that supposedly improved the flavor of the tea. He added water to this pot, allowing it to heat slowly, not rushing the process, attending to it with the same careful attention he brought to all his activities. When the water reached the proper temperature, not quite boiling but close, he added tea leaves from a small package wrapped in paper. These were genuine tea leaves from China, carefully processed, dried, and compressed into a cake that had been broken into small pieces for travel. The tea was expensive, valuable, a luxury that most travelers could not afford. But for him it was apparently worth the cost. The leaves unfurled in the hot water, releasing their color and flavor, transforming clear water into golden brown liquid that steamed with aromatic vapor. He poured this tea into a small cup, no larger than a child's fist, and sipped it slowly, holding each mouthful for a moment before swallowing, clearly savoring both flavor and temperature. The ritual of morning tea was, for him, as important as the morning meditation, another form of practice, another way of marking the transition from sleep to waking, from private consciousness to engagement with the world. He poured a second cup, and a third, drinking slowly, not rushing, allowing the tea and the morning to unfold at their own pace. The light was increasing steadily now, the eastern sky showing definite color, first deep blue, then lighter blue tinged with green, then yellow appearing along the horizon, then orange, the colors stacking themselves in bands that grew brighter moment by moment. The stars were fading, the brighter ones, still visible but losing their brilliance as the sky brightened, soon to disappear entirely as daylight claimed dominance. The transition from night to day was one of the fundamental rhythms of existence, repeated endlessly, yet somehow remaining fresh, remaining capable of commanding attention, remaining worthy of observation and appreciation. The Muslim merchant who had performed the morning prayer was now heating water for his own tea, a preparation simpler than the Eastern merchant's elaborate process, but serving a similar purpose, warming the body, providing gentle stimulation, marking the beginning of the day's activities. He used simple green tea mixed with mint leaves, a common combination throughout the Islamic world, creating a beverage that was both refreshing and soothing, combining the astringency of tea with the cooling properties of mint in a balance that pleased the palate and aided digestion. Other merchants were preparing their own breakfast meals, simple foods that required minimal cooking, flatbread from the previous day, softened by warming, eaten with dates or dried fruits or small amounts of cheese if they had it, washed down with tea or simple water. The morning meal was not elaborate. It existed primarily to provide fuel for the coming day's travel, to give the body something to work with during the hours ahead when food would not be available, when all energy would be devoted to movement, to covering distance, to progressing along the route toward distant destinations. The camels in the courtyard were beginning to stir, responding to the growing light and activity, making their peculiar sounds, grumbling, rumbling, occasional bellowing complaints about hunger or discomfort, or simple protest against the coming demands of another day's travel. The camel drivers were moving among them, checking hobbles, examining feet for sores or stones, patting necks, and speaking in low voices, maintaining the relationships between human and animal that made caravan travel possible. Camels were not affectionate creatures, not in the way that horses or dogs could be, but they responded to consistent treatment, to predictable routines, to handlers who understood their nature and worked with it rather than against it. The sky continued to brighten, the sun preparing to make its appearance, still below the horizon, but announcing its imminent arrival through the increasing light, through the warming of the air that was already beginning, despite the sun's absence. The cold was retreating, not disappearing, but losing its sharp edge, becoming something that could be endured without discomfort, that would soon be replaced by warmth and then by heat as the day progressed. Ardashir began to pack his sleeping materials, rolling the felt tightly, securing it with the leather straps, coiling the straps properly so they would not tangle. He folded the cotton sheet, matching corner to corner, creating neat creases, reducing it to a compact square that would fit easily in his bag. He folded his blanket with similar care, treating these textiles with respect, understanding that they were tools as important as any commercial goods he carried, that proper rest depended on proper sleeping equipment, that the care he gave these materials now would determine their longevity and continued usefulness. As he worked, the sun finally appeared, the first arc of its disk rising above the eastern horizon, golden and brilliant, flooding the desert with light, transforming the landscape from shadowy gray to vivid color, bringing sharp definition to everything, creating strong contrasts between light and shadow. The moment of sunrise was always dramatic, always seemed miraculous despite occurring every day, always felt like a beginning, like creation renewed, like a promise that day would follow night, that light would follow darkness, that life would continue in its established patterns. The merchants who were awake greeted the sunrise according to their various traditions. The Muslims among them faced toward Mecca and offered brief prayers of gratitude. The Buddhist merchant prostrated himself 3 times in the direction of the rising sun, acknowledging it as a symbol of enlightenment, of the dispelling of ignorance by wisdom's light. The Zoroastrian merchants, fewer in number but present, spoke prayers to Mithra, the deity associated with the sun, with contracts, with truth. Those who followed no particular tradition simply watched, appreciating the beauty, marking the moment, preparing mentally for the day ahead.